Mike Nichols' working relationship was that on Virginia Woolf, Mike was advised by his mentor, director Billy Wilder, that because he had never directed a film before, it might be useful for him to have someone on set to help him lay out shots. His editor, Doane Harrison, was hired. They did not get along, and Doane quit. Sam was hired to be, they called him the cutter, and he was going to assemble the film while Doane helped Mike lay out the shots. Suddenly, Mike was left in the lurch a bit and would just ask Sam to come down onto the set occasionally for just challenges and problems. What camera angle should we use for this, or how will this come together? When they ended up doing The Graduate together, Mike actually said, "You have to come with me, Sam. There's a whole world out there for you to experience. Don't stay at Warner's." He was a staff editor at Warner's. Because of what they had done together, that was such a critical success. Mike Nichols, he had much more freedom to really do pretty much what he wanted. He had 6 months to prep on that movie, which is kind of amazing, and the Los Angelesization of America and all the different crew people he brought with him to have a very specific point of view, both visually and thematically. And Sam was a part of that. In fact, Sam's clothes were used as a model for Dustin Hoffman's character because he was trying to figure out what Los Angeles people dress like, and he saw Sam's windbreaker and said, "Dress him like Sam." Sam was at every rehearsal. There was 3 weeks of rehearsal. They worked out a lot of the staging, which was a really big part and power of The Graduate. The staging was very much influenced by Mike Nichols' extraordinary theatrical career. He was boy wonder on Broadway. The other thing is the cameraman, Bob Surtees, he was an extraordinary cinematographer who had over 30 years experience by the time he worked on The Graduate, but he was very happy that he was a part of this project. He watched Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf with his guys, his crew, and he said, "Oh boy, I think we're gonna do some really crazy stuff on this movie. You know, fasten your seatbelts, basically." And then he said that when he did The Graduate, he used every trick he ever learned in his career. Sam had actually worked with him on a film before called Kisses for My President. They knew each other, they liked each other, and they were all sort of a triad together starting in rehearsals. And on The Graduate, Sam was on set for every single setup, for every single shot on the film. And they continued to do that for their entire working relationship, which went on for 28 years on 11 films. Mike Nichols' strengths were performance, words, staging. Sam's strengths were seeing the big picture, being very strong with transitions and pacing and character arcs and story arcs as well. But also there's sort of a spatial visual part that Bob Surtees and Sam brought to it.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to begin our descent into Los Angeles.
I think it was the times, too. I think the influences of that era. Definitely Mike Nichols was influenced by people like Fellini and Antonioni and Bergman. The other thing that's really interesting is there's this whole bipolar kind of shooting. He does a lot of very long lenses, telephoto lenses, where everything's very flat. The classic example is Benjamin running to the church at the end of the movie, where it's an extremely long lens, and what it does is as he's running to the screen, he's running full bore, but he doesn't seem to be getting anywhere because it flattens. The flattening makes him look like he's running in place. One of the big powers for me of The Graduate is the extremely strong point of view. Right away, there's a lot of mise-en-scène in this movie where you have scenes where there's virtually no editing and they just play out very much like a play. And then you have flash cutting, like the scene when she traps him in the bedroom and she's naked. If you hadn't had all the slow, lengthy scenes before that, it wouldn't have the power it has. I interviewed Sam about his entire career for a book, but after he died, I started teaching The Graduate at NYU and various other places, and I decided to look at the line script, which I knew he had, and I knew it was basically like looking at dailies, because a line script is basically lines running down a page. And depending how far down the lines go on that page, will say what part of the scene was covered by specific angles, and each line represents a camera angle. And the details of every shot are in that line script, including the lenses, how long the shots were, changes that were made from the original script. So all of that information was very interesting to teach, but what was most extraordinary to me, which I never got to ask him about, was that there are a lot of scenes that were covered conventionally that were never used. So they did cover themselves. I'm using cover in another sense now, in case some of the crazy stuff they did wouldn't work. Very ambitious. And the director that influenced him the most when he was making The Graduate was George Stevens. And George Stevens was a classically trained and skillful director, kind of an unsung hero in the film world. A Place in the Sun, which he mentioned quite a bit when he was talking about The Graduate. There's a scene where Montgomery Clift shows up at Elizabeth Taylor's house, and she's very rich and very sophisticated, and he's the poor cousin who's madly in love with her. And the entire scene is shot so similarly to the den scene in The Graduate. It's all about power positioning and foreground, background, the emphasis of who's in control in the scene at different times.
Would you mind walking ahead of me to the sun porch?
This scene is about seducing him by pretending to be vulnerable and sort of making these inappropriate confessions and pulling him in. There's very specific beats in that scene, and Sam held off on cutting until they happened. So important at this point to just have so much empathy for him, because we're pretty sure what she's doing. We're not 100% sure, but we're pretty sure. And she's so ahead of him. So all of this is done beautifully with editing, letting these moments play out. So the next thing, which I think was probably my favorite thing in that whole scene in terms of editing, is she leaves the frame to go put on music. Now, they shot the record player, they shot her putting the record on, and of course the timing of that is slow, and that would have killed the momentum of all this awkwardness and tension. The scene where he gets the purse for her and she's upstairs and where should I put it, that was also interesting editorially, because the comedy is the empty staircase and Benjamin appearing in and out of it in a panic.
Mrs. Robinson?
I'm in the bathroom.
Well, here's the purse.
They shot him getting the purse, a coverage. They never used it because they saw that the staging of that worked and the framing and all of the comedy of that. The most famous cut in the movie, which is a wild and crazy cut, is when Benjamin jumps out of the swimming pool into bed with Mrs. Robinson. So in a way, this was an accident too, because a good action cut means that you change angles as much as possible so an audience is not disoriented. So what they wanted to do is go low and close when he jumps out of the pool, and over their bodies high from a certain angle when he jumps on top of her. But they couldn't do that. So the angle from him jumping out of the pool is the same angle as him jumping onto her. Sam was extremely worried that it would be jarring. So he immediately ordered it as soon as possible. He cut it together. So the other thing that was different in the line script was the ending. The ending, they do run away from the church and get on the bus and walk to the back of the bus. So she kisses him on the nose, which never happens. And it's sort of a brief moment where she reaches for his hand and says, "Ben," and he says, "What?" And they sort of look at each other. And then the last shot of the movie is actually through the back of the bus. You see all these people in black outside the church running around like Keystone Cops. And so you sort of cap it off with this comedy, ridiculous grown-ups moment. the collaboration between Mike and Sam was a great yin-yang kind of situation, commonalities and yin-yang, because they both were very strong people and very confident in their own way, but in very different ways. I mean, Sam was very strong in terms of this instinctual thing about how people show themselves in their behavior. And Mike was a wordsmith. It was all about words. It was all about performance. He was brilliant at that. That Mike, to his credit, knew what his weaknesses were and was not uncomfortable asking for the help of an editor and having everyone see it. I mean, I think that's partly a measure of confidence. Some editors don't like to be on the set because they'd rather just look at the film, but that Sam liked that kind of control. I think they both liked having a lot of control over their work, and I think somehow that worked. And he changed cinematographers a lot, but he never changed editors. They went on to do so many different genres. I mean, they really didn't stick to one particular kind of movie. The fact that Sam and Mike sort of made their names together, the big success doing true art, there was a bond that was immeasurable. But of course, he did work with Roman Polanski and Robert Benton and Sidney Lumet and a lot of interesting directors. But I think also this experience of being on set, he didn't do with other directors. So that was an unusual role. The real power of this moment in their careers was that they had no idea. They had no idea what this was going to be. They really were in shock. And when he describes the previews for The Graduate, he said the highest high he ever had in his career, because when you have no expectations and then it's so extraordinary, I think you can't compete with that.